I spent 5 years building a throne for the Hargrove family, brick by grueling brick, only to find out they didn't even think I was worthy of sitting on the floor. My name is Astrid. In the high society circles of Boston, specifically the cobblestone prestige of Beacon Hill, names like mine usually come with a pedigree. I didn't have one. What I had was a law degree from a top-tier university and a brain for forensic accounting that could make the most complex tax shelters look like a child's puzzle. To the Hargroves, I was a convenient asset, a senior tax attorney who could navigate the IRS like a seasoned captain through a storm, all while being expected to serve tea with a smile at their charity galas. The tension in our household reached a boiling point on a Tuesday in mid-October. I walked into the library of our family estate to find my husband, Dominic, and my mother-in-law, Adelaide, staring at a stack of certified mail. Dominic's face was the color of curdled milk. The IRS had issued a notice of deficiency. They weren't just asking questions. They were threatening to dismantle the Hargrove Investment Group over a $15 million discrepancy involving offshore accounts I had warned them about years ago. Adelaide didn't look at me as a daughter-in-law. She looked at me as a fire extinguisher. She tapped the documents with a manicured finger and said, "Fix this, Astrid. The Hargrove name cannot be dragged through the mud by government bureaucrats." I didn't complain. I didn't point out that I had spent months advising them against the very aggressive tax positions that landed them in this mess. Instead, I retreated to my office in the financial district. For the next 3 weeks, the sun became a stranger. I lived on black coffee and the hum of my laptop, meticulously deconstructing 5 years of financial records. I worked through the nights, cross-referencing ledger entries with bank statements from the Cayman Islands, finding the specific legal loopholes and filing the necessary curative documents to mitigate the penalties. I managed to negotiate a settlement that reduced their liability by nearly 80% and, more importantly, kept the Department of Justice from opening a criminal investigation. I saved their legacy. I saved Dominic from a potential prison sentence. A week later, Adelaide hosted a victory dinner at one of the most exclusive clubs in the city. The room was filled with Boston's elite, people who measure their worth by the date their ancestors arrived in the harbor. I sat at the table, exhausted, my mind still racing with tax codes, expecting a simple "thank you." Instead, as the champagne was poured, Adelaide stood up to address the guests. "We are so proud of Dominic," she beamed, her diamonds catching the light. "He showed such incredible leadership during this recent, administrative hiccup with the authorities. It's his vision that keeps this family secure." Then, she glanced at me as if I were a smudge on the silverware. "And of course, Astrid was there to handle the clerical side of things. She's quite a capable typist when she needs to be." The table chuckled. Dominic didn't correct her. He just squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture that felt less like support and more like a command to stay quiet. I looked at him, searching for a spark of integrity, but all I saw was a man who was happy to let his wife be the invisible foundation of his unearned status. I swallowed my pride. I told myself it didn't matter. I thought that as long as I was indispensable, I was safe. That was my first mistake. By early November, the atmosphere in our home shifted. Dominic, who usually spent his evenings at his club or ignoring me in favor of his tablet, became hauntingly attentive. He started bringing home lilies, my favorite, and talking about our long-term future. One evening, while we were overlooking the city lights, he turned to me with a look of practiced sincerity. "Astrid, you've worked so hard for this family. You've proven you can handle the corporate world, but don't you think it's time we focused on something more permanent? A legacy of our own?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that after years of me carrying the financial weight of his family's mistakes, he finally wanted to build a home with me. I didn't realize that his legacy had a price tag. I knew about the Hargrove Trust. It was a $50 million fund established by his grandfather, locked behind a series of ironclad fiduciary conditions. One of those conditions was the birth of a fourth-generation heir. Without a child, Dominic's access to the principal was restricted, and his personal debts he thought I didn't know about, were mounting. He didn't want a family. He wanted a key to a vault. A few days later, I found myself in the bathroom of our master suite, staring at a plastic stick. 2 distinct lines. I felt a surge of genuine joy, a warmth that I hadn't felt in years. I thought, this is it. This changes everything. I walked into the bedroom to show him, but the door was ajar. I heard his voice coming from his dressing room, low and hurried. He was on the phone with his sister, Vanessa. "It's confirmed," Dominic whispered, and even through the door, I could hear the cold calculation in his tone. "She's pregnant. The lawyers say that's enough to trigger the first disbursement of the trust by the end of the quarter. Once the paperwork is filed and the money moves, we can start phase 2. I can't play the doting husband forever, Vanessa. This house is starting to feel like a cage." I stood there, the pregnancy test still warm in my hand, as the world I had built for them turned to ash. I wasn't his wife. I wasn't even the architect of their empire anymore. I was a biological milestone in a financial transaction. I didn't walk in. I didn't scream. I went back to my office, locked the door, and looked at the test again. The joy was gone, replaced by the sharp, familiar clarity of a woman who knows exactly how to read a contract. They thought they had won. They thought I was the weak link they could use and discard. They forgot one thing. I'm the one who knows where all the bodies are buried, because I'm the one who dug the graves for their taxes. After that night in the hallway, everything in the Hargrove estate became disturbingly sweet, like a dessert with too much saccharin. Dominic transformed. The man who used to barely acknowledge my existence unless he needed a spreadsheet analyzed was suddenly bringing home bouquets of calla lilies every other day. He started taking over the kitchen, insisting on preparing my dinners himself, claiming he wanted to ensure I was getting the optimal caloric intake for the heir. He spoke about the $50 million trust fund frequently now, but he'd always frame it as a secondary thought. "It's just a safety net, Astrid," he'd say while stirring a pot of organic risotto. "The money doesn't matter. What matters is that our child has a foundation that can't be shaken. We're building a dynasty." I wanted to believe the warmth in his eyes was real. I wanted to tell myself that the phone call I'd overheard was just a cold-blooded way for a businessman to process his emotions. I tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, the prospect of a son had finally cracked the ice in his heart. But then the isolation started. It wasn't a sudden lock and key. It was a slow, professional strangulation. Adelaide and Dominic sat me down in the sunroom during the second week of November. The atmosphere was thick with faux concern. Adelaide reached across the tea table and patted my hand, her eyes hard as emeralds. "Astrid, darling, your managing partner at the firm called me. He's worried about your billable hours. This tax litigation you're handling, it's too much. The stress, the late nights in the financial district. It's poison for a developing baby." Dominic chimed in, his voice a smooth baritone of manipulation. "I've already looked at our finances, Astrid. You've more than earned a break. I want you to take a formal sabbatical. No more IRS negotiations. No more forensic audits. Just focus on being a mother. I've had my lawyers draft a temporary leave of absence agreement with your firm." As a senior tax attorney, I knew exactly what temporary meant when someone else drafted the paperwork. It meant losing my leverage. It meant being cut off from my own income stream. I fought them for 3 days, arguing that my work was my identity. But the gaslighting was relentless. They made me feel like an egoist, a woman who valued her career over the heartbeat inside her. Eventually, under the weight of their collective pressure and my own overwhelming desire to protect my pregnancy, I signed. I handed over my active cases to a junior associate and watched as the digital tether to my professional life was severed. Then came Vanessa. Dominic's sister moved into the guest wing 2 days later. She claimed she was there to be my wellness doula, a role she'd invented to justify her presence. Vanessa was the quintessential Boston socialite, all yoga retreats and expensive green juices. Every morning, she'd march into my room with a porcelain cup of specialty herbal tea. "It's an old family recipe, Astrid," she'd chirp, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Bitter herbs for uterine strength. It's imported from a private apothecary in Switzerland. It's exactly what a Hargrove mother needs." The tea was foul. It had an acrid metallic aftertaste that clung to the back of my throat. When I questioned the ingredients, Vanessa would just toss her hair and laugh. "Oh, don't be so analytical, Astrid. Not everything is a tax code. Just trust the process." By the end of November, the process was killing me. I began to feel a persistent thrumming in my temples that never went away. My heart would suddenly race, a terrifying tachycardia that left me breathless while simply sitting on the sofa. My vision would blur at the edges, and a heavy, leaden fatigue settled into my bones. When I insisted on seeing a doctor, Adelaide didn't take me to my usual OB/GYN at MGH. Instead, she drove me to a private boutique clinic in the Back Bay. The physician, a man named Dr. Sterling who looked like he'd been handpicked from a country club, gave me a cursory exam. "My heart rate is hovering at 110 at rest, doctor," I told him, my voice trembling with an uncharacteristic fear. "And these headaches, they feel like a vice." Dr. Sterling didn't even look up from his tablet. "Standard gestational hypertension, Astrid. You're a high achiever. Your body is simply struggling to adjust to a slower pace. You're overthinking your symptoms. It's quite common for women of your professional background to develop psychosomatic anxieties during the first trimester." "Psychosomatic?" I countered, my legal mind bristling. "I know my body. This isn't anxiety. This is physiological." "Relax, dear," Adelaide interrupted from the corner of the room, her voice dripping with condescension. "The doctor knows best. You're just being high-strung. Perhaps another cup of Vanessa's tea will calm your nerves." They drove me home like a prisoner in a luxury sedan. That night, the nausea hit with a violence that felt personal. I spent hours huddled on the cold marble floor of the master bathroom, my body rejecting everything. When I finally managed to pull myself up to the vanity, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. My skin was sallow, my eyes were sunken and underlined with deep shadows, and my hands, the hands that could navigate the most treacherous financial audits, were shaking uncontrollably. I looked like a ghost haunting my own life. As I rinsed my mouth, I heard a faint rustle by the door. I turned slowly. The door was cracked open just an inch. Through the gap, I saw Vanessa. She wasn't rushing in to help me. She was leaning against the hallway wall, watching me with a chilling, satisfied composure. In her hand, she held a small, amber glass bottle, the kind used for high-potency tinctures. The label had been meticulously peeled off, leaving only a sticky, white residue. She caught my eye through the reflection in the mirror. She didn't flinch. She just offered a small, knowing smile, tucked the bottle into her silk robe pocket, and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. I stood there, the taste of bile and copper in my mouth, realizing that the perfect future Dominic had promised wasn't a dynasty. It was a slow-motion execution. And I had just signed away the only professional shield I had to stop them. The air in Boston on Christmas Eve was sharp enough to cut, a bitter wind whipping the snow into drifts against the limestone walls of the Hargrove estate. Inside, the mansion was a masterclass in seasonal opulence. Boughs of fresh noble fir draped over the mahogany banisters, the scent of expensive cinnamon candles, and a tree so tall it required a ladder to decorate. To any of the guests arriving downstairs, we were the picture of a dynastic success story. To me, the house felt like a velvet-lined tomb. My heart was doing something terrifying. It wasn't just a flutter. It was a rhythmic, punishing thumping against my ribs that made my breath come in shallow hitches. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the room fraying into a hazy blur. I knew it was the tea. I knew it with a cold, forensic certainty. Vanessa had brought me one last cup while I was sitting at my vanity, struggling to zip up my white silk evening gown. "Drink up, Astrid," she had whispered, her hand resting on my shoulder with a weight that felt like a threat. "You need your strength to greet the board members. We can't have you looking frail." I had swallowed it, desperate to keep the peace for just one more night, hoping that if I played the part of the perfect wife, I could find a way to escape later. That was my second error in judgment. 10 minutes before the first toast, Vanessa cornered me. She didn't do it in front of the help. She led me into the second-floor library, a room lined with leather-bound books that smelled of old money and dust. She locked the door behind us. The festive music from the foyer was a muffled thrum through the floorboards. "You look pathetic," Vanessa said, her voice stripped of its sugary wellness guru persona. "Did you really think you were going to be the mistress of this house? You're a placeholder, Astrid. A glorified incubator with a law degree." I reached for my clutch on the library table, needing my phone to call my friend Serafina. My fingers met empty air. My bag was gone. My car keys, my phone, my identification, everything had been scrubbed from the room. "Where is my bag, Vanessa?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the tachycardia making my head swim. "Don't worry about the bag," she sneered, stepping closer. "Worry about the fact that Dominic already moved the first 10 million from the trust into a shell account in the Grenadines. We don't need you anymore. The pregnancy triggered the disbursement clause, and since you've been so unstable and hypertensive lately, the medical record we've been building will make the divorce look like an act of mercy." The sheer scale of the premeditation hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just stealing my life, they were archiving my downfall. I pushed past her, my legs feeling like lead, and staggered toward the door. I needed to get to the guests. If there were witnesses, they couldn't hurt me. I made it to the landing of the grand staircase. The wooden steps were gleaming, reflecting the light from the chandelier above. I didn't see the shimmer of the excess wax until it was too late. Vanessa had spent the afternoon helping the cleaning crew, specifically focusing on the high-traffic areas. Dominic appeared at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man watching a clock. "Astrid, you're making a scene," he called out, his voice loud enough for the staff in the kitchen to hear. "Are you drinking again? I told you the stress of your affair was going to catch up with you." The accusation was so blatant, so absurdly false, that it momentarily stopped my heart. He was setting the narrative for the prenup, infidelity and mental instability. I opened my mouth to scream, to tell him I knew about the Grenadines, but my foot hit the slick patch on the top step. The world tilted. It wasn't like the movies. There was no slow motion, just a series of dull, sickening thuds as my body collided with the mahogany edges of the stairs. I came to rest on the cold marble of the foyer, a sharp, white-hot agony radiating from my abdomen. It felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. I looked up. My white dress was rapidly blooming with a dark, terrifying crimson. I reached out a hand toward Dominic. "Help! Call 911. He didn't move. He stood 3 feet away, hands in his tuxedo pockets. Vanessa stepped up beside him. Dominic slowly raised his left arm and looked at his Patek Philippe. The doctor said 15 minutes of sustained trauma and blood loss would be the point of no return for the fetus, Vanessa murmured. Her voice was as calm as if she were discussing a weather report. "I know," Dominic replied. I lay there, the marble floor leaching the heat from my body, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses from the dining room just 30 feet away. I was dying. My child was dying, and my husband was counting the seconds. I watched the second hand on his watch sweep around the dial. 1 minute. 5. 10. I tried to crawl, but the pain was a physical weight pinning me down. I focused on Dominic's face. I wanted to etch every line of his indifference into my memory if I survived. He wasn't even angry. He was just waiting for a transaction to clear. At exactly the 15-minute mark, Dominic let out a long theatrical sigh. He ruffled his hair, untied his bow tie, and suddenly shifted his face into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Astrid! Oh my God, Astrid!" he screamed, his voice breaking with a practiced grief that made my skin crawl. He fell to his knees beside me, not to hold me, but to make sure he was in a convincing position when the staff rounded the corner. "Vanessa, call an ambulance. She fell. My wife fell." In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren cut through the Boston night, reflecting off the snow-covered windows. As the lights of the emergency vehicles began to flash blue and red against the foyer walls, Dominic leaned down, his lips brushing my ear. "You're worthless to me now, Astrid," he whispered, so low that only I could hear. "I hope you enjoyed the tea." The darkness finally rushed in to meet me, but even as I drifted out, a single, cold thought remained. I am a forensic accountant. And you just left a paper trail of blood. The silence of a hospital room in the early hours of Christmas morning is a specific kind of heavy. It's not peaceful. It's clinical, sterile, and punctuated by the rhythmic, taunting hiss of an oxygen flow that I didn't even want. When I finally drifted back to consciousness at Massachusetts General, the first thing I noticed wasn't the pain in my body, which felt like I'd been hollowed out with a blunt chisel, but the absence of the frantic, terrifying tachycardia that had plagued me for weeks. The tea's poison was finally clearing my system, but it had already finished its job. The room was a VIP suite, all muted beiges and expensive wood paneling, designed to make you forget you were in a place of suffering. I was alone. No Dominic. No Vanessa. Just the gray Boston sky visible through the reinforced glass, dropping thick, indifferent flakes of snow onto the Charles River. A nurse came in around 7 a.m. She didn't look me in the eye when she checked my vitals. I asked her where my husband was. "Mr. Hargrove was here earlier, dear," she said, her voice strained with a pity I found nauseating. He was quite distraught. He told the staff he needed to go home to handle some urgent family matters and try to find some composure. He said he'd be back once you were more stable. Distraught. Right. I knew Dominic. He wasn't distraught. He was likely at home with a bottle of aged scotch, toasted to the success of his Phase 2. An hour later, the door didn't just open. It was occupied. Adelaide Hargrove marched in, draped in a charcoal cashmere coat that cost more than most people's annual salary. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't bring a card. She brought a slim, black leather briefcase. She didn't even wait for me to sit up before she clicked the latches open. "I trust the surgery went as well as could be expected," she said, her voice as sharp as a razor on a winter morning. She didn't look at the bandages. She didn't ask how I was breathing. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them onto the bed, right on top of my legs. I looked down. In the trial court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Probate and Family Court Department. Complaint for divorce. Dominic has already signed, Adelaide stated, her eyes fixed on me with a cold, predatory intensity. We've filed under the grounds of an irretrievable breakdown, but given your recent medical history, the hypertension, the clear signs of mental instability leading to this unfortunate accident, the conduct provisions in your prenuptial agreement have been triggered. You're leaving with your initial assets and a modest relocation stipend. Nothing more. I stared at her, my throat so dry it felt like I was swallowing glass. My child died 12 hours ago, Adelaide. Your grandchild. She didn't flinch. That child was the only reason you were tolerated in Beacon Hill, Astrid. A Hargrove mother needs to be resilient, capable of carrying the legacy. You've proven you're a faulty vessel. To be blunt, you are worthless to this family now. You're a liability we are no longer willing to underwrite. She leaned over the bed, her perfume, something floral and suffocating, filling my lungs. Sign the acknowledgement of service. Don't make this a spectacle. We've already had your things packed and sent to a storage unit in Chelsea. You won't be returning to the estate. She left a gold Mont Blanc pen on top of the papers and walked out without a backward glance. I sat there, the weight of the divorce papers feeling heavier than the anesthesia. For a split second, I considered it. I considered just signing, taking the stipend, and disappearing. I felt broken. I felt like the faulty vessel she described. I picked up the pen, my fingers hovering over the signature line. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my body had failed. Then the door opened again. A different nurse this time, younger, with a quick, alert gaze. She was carrying a tray of fresh linens, but she wasn't looking at the bed. She was looking at the hallway. She moved toward the head of my bed, pretending to adjust my pillow. As she leaned down, she slid a thick, brown padded envelope from her cart and tucked it deep under my pillow. "Serafina told me you'd be awake," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the monitors. "She said don't sign a single thing. She's been sitting in the parking garage since 4 a.m. waiting for me to get on shift. She said to tell you, Astrid, be the lawyer, not the victim. Look at the data." The nurse squeezed my hand once and disappeared as quickly as she'd arrived. With trembling hands, I reached under the GUI and pulled out the envelope. Inside was a small, handwritten note from Serafina and a brilliant, blood-red USB drive. "I've known those snakes were up to something since your 3rd prenatal visit," the note read. "The blood work didn't lie, but I needed more. I took a chance and planted a voice-activated recorder in Dominic's library on the 23rd when I dropped off those vitamins he insisted on. Listen to the file from Christmas Eve. I'm downstairs. Give me the signal when you're ready to burn their world down." I reached for the laptop Serafina had surreptitiously sent up with my personal effects earlier. My hands were still shaking, but the fog of grief was being burned away by a sudden, piercing surge of adrenaline. I wasn't just a woman who had lost a child. I was a forensic accountant who had spent a decade finding the truth in the spaces between lies. I plugged the red drive into the port. A single audio file appeared. audio_log_dec 24_2000.mp3. I took a deep breath, the hospital's blue light reflecting in my eyes, and hit play. The click of the mouse felt like a hammer striking an anvil in the dead air of that hospital room. I adjusted the headphones, the sterile white of the sheets reflecting in the screen of my laptop. The one Serafina had surreptitiously returned to me under the guise of personal comfort items. The audio file hissed for a second before the acoustics of the Hargrove library filled my ears. It was unmistakable. Vanessa's voice was light, almost airy, as if she were discussing the guest list for a gala rather than the systematic poisoning of her sister-in-law. "The tincture is working perfectly, Dom," she said. I could almost hear the clink of her glass. Her blood pressure was through the roof this morning. Dr. Sterling is already primed to call it gestational stress. Another week of this and her body will do the rest of the work for us. Then came Dominic. My husband. The man I had pulled from the brink of financial ruin only a year ago. "Good," he replied, his tone chillingly bored. "The trust lawyers confirmed the pregnancy is enough to unlock the initial $10 million tranche for family security. Once the miscarriage happens, we trigger the instability clause in the prenup. She'll be out with nothing but a few months of alimony and a bruised ego. I'm tired of her looking over my shoulder every time I move money to the Grenadines. She thinks she's the smartest person in the room because she can read a ledger. It's annoying." I sat perfectly still. I expected to feel a wave of nausea or the urge to scream. Instead, a profound, crystalline coldness settled over me. It was the same feeling I got when I found a hidden discrepancy in a multi-million-dollar audit, a predatory focus. The woman who had been weeping over a lost child for the last 12 hours didn't exist anymore. In her place sat a senior tax attorney who had just found the ultimate smoking gun. The recording continued. I heard the scuffle, the heavy thuds of my own body falling down the mahogany stairs, and then silence. For a long, agonizing stretch there was nothing. Then Dominic's voice, hushed and sharp. "Wait, don't call yet. Look at her. She's still moving." "Should we?" Vanessa whispered. "No. Sterling said 15 minutes of sustained trauma ensures the failure. If we call now, the MGH trauma team might save it. We wait." I stopped the recording. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I took the headphones off and looked out at the Boston skyline. They thought my value was tied to my womb. They truly believed that by stripping away my motherhood, they had stripped away my power. They had forgotten that I was the one who built their armor. I knew every seam, every weak point, and every rusted bolt in the Hargrove empire. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Serafina through an encrypted app. "I heard it," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "Astrid, thank God," she breathed. "I have the independent tox report. Your blood was a cocktail of concentrated stimulants and high-potency diuretics. It's enough for a criminal indictment in Massachusetts. But you know the Hargroves. They'll buy their way out of a local precinct before the ink is dry." "I know," I replied, looking at the blinking cursor on my laptop. "That's why we're not going to the police yet. I'm going to use the one thing they fear more than prison: the federal government." Over the next 48 hours, I lived in the digital shadows. Dominic and Adelaide were so convinced I was a broken vessel that they hadn't even bothered to revoke my administrative credentials for the Hargrove Investment Group's internal servers. It was the ultimate arrogance. They assumed I was too busy mourning to be a threat. I spent the nights of December 26th and 27th performing a forensic autopsy on their lives. I bypassed the hush-hush folders and went straight for the encrypted subledgers. I found Dominic's secret debts, $30 million in offshore crypto-leverage loans that he'd been hiding from his mother. I found the paper trail of the Grenadines accounts. But most importantly, I found the unredacted tax filings from 5 years ago, the ones I had helped rectify. I had been their architect. I had used every legal maneuver in the book to keep them compliant. But the law is a double-edged sword. If the rectification was based on fraudulent information provided by the client, the liability shifted back to them, with interest, penalties, and a mandatory referral to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I wasn't just filing for divorce. I was preparing an IRS whistleblower claim that would net me 30% of the recovered taxes and bury the Hargroves under a mountain of federal litigation. By the morning of December 28th, the sun was rising over the Atlantic, painting the hospital room in a sharp, unforgiving gold. I closed my laptop and handed a secured drive to the nurse Serafina had assigned to me. "Take this to the safe deposit box," I instructed. I looked in the vanity mirror. My face was pale, but my eyes were clear. The sunken, haunted look of the last month had been replaced by the lethal composure of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and a very long memory. The same nurse who had smuggled the USB in returned with a garment bag. Inside was my black wool power suit, the one I wore to close the most difficult acquisitions, and a tube of the deep red lipstick I used when I needed to look like I owned the room. "You're being discharged in an hour," she said, looking at me with a mix of awe and concern. "Where are you going?" I applied the lipstick with a steady hand, the color a stark contrast to the white hospital walls. "I'm going back to Beacon Hill," I said, catching my own gaze in the glass. "I need to collect my things. And then I'm going to show the Hargroves exactly how much an invisible architect is worth when she decides to pull the foundation out from under the house." I stood up, the pain in my body now just a dull hum, a reminder of the debt they owed me. I wasn't leaving MGH as a patient. I was leaving as the grim reaper of their financial existence. The drive from Massachusetts General to Beacon Hill was short, but it felt like a crossing into another life. I sat in the back of a black sedan driven by my private driver, one of the few people on my payroll whose loyalty I had bought with respect rather than a Hargrove paycheck. I was wearing a charcoal wool power suit, the tailoring as sharp as a blade, and my hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. I looked like a woman going to close a billion-dollar merger, not a patient who had just been discharged from the trauma ward. My reflection in the tinted window was unrecognizable from the hollowed-out version of myself that had spent the last week staring at the hospital ceiling. The red lipstick was more than just a cosmetic choice. It was a war paint. When the car pulled up to the limestone estate, the iron gates hissed open with a familiar, mechanical indifference. I walked up the steps where I had fallen just a week ago, but this time my feet were steady. I didn't ring the bell. I used my own key, the one Adelaide assumed I'd never get the chance to use again. The click of my heels on the marble foyer was the only warning they got. I followed the sound of voices toward the sun-drenched breakfast room. The scene was almost comical in its normalcy. Dominic was leaning over his tablet, probably checking the crypto markets. Vanessa was taking a selfie with a kale smoothie, and Adelaide was presiding over the silver coffee service like a queen in exile. They were laughing. I heard the word Miami mentioned just as I crossed the threshold. "The oceanfront penthouse in Bal Harbor," Vanessa was saying, her voice a shrill melody of greed. "Dominic, with the trust disbursement, we could—" The fork in Dominic's hand hit his china plate with a sharp clink as he saw me. He went ashen, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. Adelaide's hand froze mid-pour, coffee spilling onto the white linen tablecloth. "Astrid," Adelaide breathed, her voice a mix of shock and immediate irritation. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to be picked up by a transport service for your mother's place." I didn't answer. I walked straight to the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the most senior member of the household, and pulled it out. I sat down with a deliberate, slow grace. I decided that the professor's house was a little too quiet for me to concentrate on the upcoming legal work, I said, my voice as even as a grinding stone. Adelaide regained her composure quickly, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You shouldn't be here. We've already arranged for your belongings to be moved. You have a complaint for divorce waiting for your signature. You're trespassing, Astrid." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of papers she had thrown at me in the hospital. I slid them across the table toward her. Every single page was slashed with a thick, red X in permanent marker. On the very first page, I had written 4 words in large, bold letters. Trash, redraft with brains. I'm a senior tax attorney, Adelaide, I said, leaning forward. Did you really think I'd accept a settlement drafted by a junior associate at a mid-tier firm? This isn't a divorce agreement. It's a joke. And since I'm the one who actually understands the tax implications of every asset this family owns, I suggest you listen very carefully. Vanessa let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Oh, please. You're just a bitter woman who couldn't even manage a pregnancy. You've lost your leverage, Astrid. The trust is unlocked. We don't need you. I turned my gaze to Vanessa. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the blood-red USB drive, placing it gently on the table. You're right, Vanessa. The trust is unlocked, I said. But so is your mouth. This drive contains the audio from the library on Christmas Eve. It contains the 2 of you discussing how you swapped my medication. It contains the moment Dominic decided to wait 15 minutes before calling for help so that my child wouldn't survive. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the far-off kitchen. Vanessa's hand started to tremble, the green smoothie spilling over the side of the glass. Dominic lunged for the drive, his hand clawing across the table. But I didn't flinch. I simply held up my phone. Don't, I said. This is already backed up to a secure cloud server. If I don't check in with my attorney every 6 hours, a copy is automatically forwarded to the district attorney, the Boston Globe, and every single one of your 5 million followers, Vanessa. I imagine your brand deals with those clean living companies won't survive the headline. Influencer charged with accessory to manslaughter. Dominic slumped back into his chair, his face a mask of sweating panic. Astrid, let's be reasonable. We can talk about the settlement. I'm done talking about settlements, I interrupted. I'm talking about consequences. As of 9 a.m. this morning, I have officially resigned as the lead counsel for the Hargrove Investment Group. I've also filed a formal notice with the IRS as a whistleblower. I've spent 5 years rectifying your books based on the fraudulent data you provided me. Now that I'm no longer under a conflict of interest, I've decided to clarify the record. I looked at Adelaide. Her face was a frozen mask of terror. She knew exactly what I was saying. Without my invisible hand managing the audits, the entire house of cards was going to collapse under the weight of federal penalties. You said I was worthless to this family, I said, standing up. I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the truth. But the truth is, this family is worthless without me. You're just 3 greedy people living on the legacy of a better man. And you're about to find out how expensive it is to pay for your own crimes. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I turned and walked out of the room, my heels clicking a steady rhythm of victory on the marble. I didn't pack a single thing. Everything in that house was stained with their presence, and I wanted none of it. I walked out the front doors and into the crisp Boston air. Serafina was waiting at the curb in her own car. She didn't say a word. She just reached over and squeezed my hand. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the mansion in the rearview mirror. I could hear Adelaide's muffled screams echoing even from the street, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the architect for the Hargroves. I was the architect of my own freedom. Sitting in the passenger seat of Serafina's car, I didn't look back at the limestone walls of the estate. My focus was entirely on the glowing screen of my laptop. I pulled up the final draft of the IRS Form 211, the official application for a whistleblower award. I had attached 5 years of encrypted subledgers, proof of the offshore shell companies in the Grenadines, and the original, unredacted financial records that Dominic had lied about. With one steady breath, I pressed send. In the world of forensic accounting, that single click is the equivalent of a carpet bombing. I wasn't just exposing a tax discrepancy. I was handing the federal government the coordinates to the Hargroves' entire financial bunker. As the confirmation email pinged, I felt a weight lift. Not the weight of grief, which would stay with me, but the weight of being their silent accomplice. The next 3 months were a blur of depositions, pre-trial motions, and meetings with the district attorney's office. Serafina had been an absolute rock. She had successfully bypassed the hospital's bureaucratic red tape to ensure my toxicological samples were processed by an independent lab in Cambridge. The results were damning. The levels of diuretics and stimulants in my system weren't just unfortunate side effects. They were evidence of a calculated attempt to induce a medical crisis. The criminal side of the case moved with a terrifying speed that even caught the Hargroves off guard. The Boston Police Department executed a search warrant on the estate in late January. They found the amber tincture bottles Vanessa had been too arrogant to dispose of, tucked away in her wellness cabinet. The climax came in mid-March, inside a wood-paneled courtroom at the Suffolk County Courthouse. Dominic sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that cost 5 figures, trying to project the image of a grieving, misunderstood widower. His legal team attempted to paint me as a disgruntled ex-wife with a history of hysterical outbursts and occupational stress. Then, my attorney called for the playback of the audio file from the red USB. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. The recording was crystal clear. When Dominic's voice filled the room, "Wait, don't call yet." Sterling said 15 minutes of sustained trauma ensures the failure. The collective gasp from the gallery felt like a physical wave. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to one of pure, unadulterated disgust. Dominic's distraught husband mask didn't just crack, it shattered. He looked at me, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I saw him for what he truly was, a small, hollow man who had mistaken cruelty for cleverness. The fallout was a total eclipse of the Hargrove name. Dominic was denied bail. Between the federal tax evasion charges and the state-level indictment for reckless endangerment and conspiracy, his legal team couldn't find a loophole big enough to crawl through. By April, the IRS had moved to freeze every single asset tied to the Hargrove Investment Group. The $50 million trust fund they had sacrificed my child for? It was seized under civil forfeiture laws to cover the back taxes and massive fraud penalties. Vanessa's downfall happened even faster. The boycott culture she had always skillfully handled suddenly became a tsunami. When the recording leaked, which I knew would happen, her brand partners not only abandoned her, but also sued her for business ethics violations. She went from 5 million followers to a social outcast overnight. She filed for bankruptcy at the end of May, unable to afford the attorney fees for her own criminal defense. And then there was Adelaide. The matriarch of Beacon Hill found out that in Boston, status is a currency that can be devalued instantly. The elite circles she lived for closed their doors. She was asked to resign from every charity board. By June, the bank had foreclosed on the estate. The throne I had spent 5 years building was sold at an auction to a tech mogul who didn't even know her name. Now, as I sit on the rooftop of my new office in the Seaport District, the Atlantic breeze is cool and smells of salt and possibility. The skyline of Boston is laid out before me, but I'm no longer looking at it from the shadows. I won the divorce, of course. Between the criminal conduct and the fraudulent prenup, the court awarded me a settlement that restored the wealth I had brought into the marriage and added a significant portion of what I had earned for them. But the money isn't the point. My new firm, Astrid & Associates, officially opened its doors this week. We specialize in forensic accounting and legal advocacy for women facing financial coercion in high net worth marriages. I've realized that my invisible skills are the most powerful weapons I have, and I'm going to use them to make sure no other woman is ever told she is worthless, simply because she doesn't fit a patriarchal mold. Yesterday, I received a letter. It was a handwritten plea from Adelaide, sent from a small one-bedroom apartment in a suburb she used to mock. She talked about family forgiveness and misunderstandings. She actually had the audacity to ask for a loan to help with her medical expenses. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a need for revenge. I simply felt nothing. I walked over to the paper shredder and watched as her desperate words turned into harmless confetti. There is no forgiveness for what they did to my child, but there is a profound peace in no longer being the one who carries their burdens. To everyone on Reddit who followed this journey, thank you for the support when I was at my lowest. They said I was worthless because I couldn't provide an heir for their rot. I proved them wrong. I provided them with a mirror, and they couldn't survive the reflection. Don't ever let someone else hold the pen when it comes to your value. You are the one who keeps the books of your own life. Make sure every entry is yours.